Welcome to Foundations of Social Work. I'm Dr. Karen Smith-Ratabi, and in this lecture, we'll think about critical thinking and critical self-reflection. These ideas are going to be critically important for you as you progress through the social work program and learn from experience as well as learning from your content and the readings and the classroom activities. Self-reflection is a core idea in social work, and it's essential. And we always consider empowerment and oppression as we move through the critical self-reflection process, and we think about reflections upon practice. So we begin with what is critical thinking, and it means that you are able to look at a person, family, or community situation, a social problem, from an objective and neutral standpoint without jumping to conclusions or making assumptions. We always seek input from those people impacted by the problem, and we consider all possibilities of explanation. Now, the idea here is we have to develop a problem statement which is integrative of all the information possible in order to come up with a conclusion about what's really going on, so we can then move forward to the critical thinking process, the who, what, where, when, to what kinds of theories are impacted in this equation. We frame up the problem from a social justice orientation. We're always thinking about equality and human dignity. And we recognize there are many societal pressures and oppressions that shape the human experience. So we're always thinking about the social justice element of the scenario that we're observing. Self-determination and empowerment are always important to problem solving. Okay, let's think about oppression first. So you see this is a dictionary definition of oppression, and you can see the very top one is prolonged, cruel, and unjust treatment or control, which is a good overview of oppression. But look at the bottom one, mental pressure or distress. And that's very clear. The idea of oppression being a source of pressure and distress on the individual, family, group, and community. So we're going to think about oppression as we move through our critical skills and our critical thinking skills. And we need to think about the observation of the problem, that problem statement, and then the dynamics of the problem. We're going to use those multiple sources of information, and we're going to reflect upon the problem and the possible solutions. And that means we're going to evaluate the causes and consequences of the problem. We're going to make an explanation of the problem, that problem statement with that social justice orientation, as well as human rights where they apply. We're going to move to the problem-solving model, and the decision result is based on the goals and objectives for change. Now you can think about that case management problem-solving model that we've already looked at and how that will apply to the decisions and goals and objectives for change. Okay, here we have a cycle of critical thinking, and this is a way to kind of simplify the whole process into one graphic. So if you start on the left-hand side, you have a who, what, when, and where kind of approach to the practice scenario or the critical incident. Now, also, we can put in that center circle the thinking about an assignment that you may have, a reading that you've been focusing on. So who, what, where, when. And so you want to move through that description part of the critical thinking cycle and start to develop a problem statement. A problem statement is very clear, simple, precise. And then how did I interact, or how did I respond as social worker to that situation, and how did the client react? So we have the whys and the hows. And here's where you'll start to select a practice theory or practice model in your analysis. Why did this happen and how did this happen, whatever the critical incident is. And you want to think about being as descriptive as you possibly can and thinking of the multiple sources of information, especially the viewpoint of the client. So the questions, how did I react? How did others react? What were my emotions? What were the emotions of others? Were my emotions helpful? And this is really important. How else could I have responded, and how could I have done this better? The how else could I respond and how could I do this better should be absolute elements for the rest of your life as a practicing social worker. But all the questions are important. So then you start to move to theory selection once you explore all these questions. And you're going to continue to build your theory base from which to practice. And then we move to the cycle to evaluations. So what did we do? What are the lessons learned and recommendations from here forward? What next, and so what? Now notice this is a cycle. There's not necessarily ever an end to this when you're working with the client. You're always thinking through the processes, what's occurring, and how could I be more effective with the client, and how can the client start to take more responsibility for their own emotions and how they're reacting to the problem. That's always important as we move through empowerment. And we also need to recognize that the clients have a whole range of emotions depending on their level of stress, that distress that comes from oppression, and whatever's happening with their own mental health and well-being. So think about this cycle of self-reflection and evaluation as you make analysis of the problems and how you're interacting with the client, but also at this stage of your learning, what's going on in those readings, because you need to be able to critically reflect upon what you're learning and reading and how you're applying new knowledge. So, critical step when considering your ideas and your readings is, what are the ideas of others as part of the critical thinking? We do value the input from your peers, not just in the school settings, but as you move along in practice settings. So asking questions of other social workers in your practice settings and getting feedback about what you're experiencing or what you've seen. This is a lifelong orientation to critical thinking in the practice domain and in your daily life. So as you look at your readings at this point, you always want to ask, what are the motives of the author or the main points? Does the reading or presentation stand up to reasoning? Are there implications for social work practice? What are the validity of the arguments? You can start asking questions about the theories that have been applied or the practice models. So this is the TAP model for thinking about your assignments. This is about being critical about your assignments. So you're going to be receiving syllabi with clear directions about what you need to be doing for assignments. So you need to be really clear when you respond. What are the central themes to that topic? What are the actions that you're being asked to do? And what are the boundaries of your assignment, the parameters? So that's the TAP set of questions. And when you start to move forward, please proofread your first draft of your writing and continue to polish and develop your arguments, your responses, so that we can see a clear and coherent framework for how you're thinking about the problem that's been posed to you. Think about that critical self-reflection graphic and how you can move through that analysis of description of the problem, analysis of the problem, and evaluation. Okay, let's look at empowerment again. We keep looking at different definitions, and here we have the authority or power given to someone to do something. That's a really different definition that we've looked for so far in social work information that we've covered. Now, think about the second one, and I like this one for social work, the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's rights. There you go. That's the one we've been using so far. And throughout your education, you will consistently be challenged if a practice behavior, strategy, or model encourages empowerment or not. Remember, we're always thinking about social control versus empowerment. Is the experience of the client one in which they're feeling greater strength and greater confidence, or are they feeling like they're being controlled? It depends on the circumstance, and that's a good example of how we can move through critical self-reflection in that description, analysis, and evaluation processing. Okay, so the values in critical thinking, think about empowerment there. We've already looked at that. And we want to think about how we are developing the self-determination of people, individuals, families, groups, and communities in order for them to represent and act on their interests in a responsible and self-determined way, exercising their own authority over the problem, their authority in developing their own problem statement, identifying their own reflective capacities and how did I respond and how could I do better, and then those lessons learned. So we always have to ask ourselves as social workers, are we moving towards resolution of a problem? And within that empowerment perspective, are the people we serve being given an opportunity to voice for their own solutions to problems? Or are we disempowering people in the process of intervention? Are we telling people what's best for them? Are we giving advice on what we think is right? And are we promoting ideas that do not encourage social change, rather promotes people accepting their unfair conditions? Again, that's social control. It's suggesting that oppression is normal and natural and people should just accept their conditions rather than look for opportunities for empowerment. So as we start to build on our own emotional self-awareness, we take the time to ask our own important questions of self. We gain better understanding of our own emotions as social workers, our personal strengths, as well as starting to identify our weaknesses for improvement. And then we start to think about how we problem solve as social workers. Think about that 5 steps of problem solving. And when you enter into a practice scenario, you're going to ask yourself, what did I do well? What could I do better? What did I learn? And how did I improve? How can I improve my response in the future? Now, this is definitely a boil down of that critical self-reflection circle of describe, analyze, and then lessons learned. But these are the basic questions here. What did I do well? What could I do better? What did I learn? And how do I improve my response in the future? Now, the improvement of your response is part of the elements of looking for your own weaknesses as well as strengths and how you can literally do better in the future. So as we challenge ourselves to improve upon our own practice, we will grow, and we reflect upon our experiences because these are sensitive issues we often encounter. And at times we may actually feel disagreement and frustration with the client, and we have to keep our emotions in check and make sure that we're not overstepping our own boundaries as helping professionals. Okay, so a lot has been written about critical thinking at this point in social work, and Matthias gives us some ways of thinking about it and some of the most frequently cited social work. I want you to look at the column on the right-hand side in the APA consensus definitions and think about, these are very basic, really simple bullets that are really useful, I think. So interpreting meaning, making analysis of relations, evaluations of claims and arguments. What are those conclusions? How do we make an explanation of the results of your reasoning? And then self-regulation of one's thinking and process. We've talked a lot about that self-regulation thus far. Now, think about how are we being inquisitive? Are we being well informed in the process? Are we drawing upon that theory and what we know from practice knowledge and the kinds of models that are available to us? Are we being open-minded to the whole variety of worldviews, especially those views of our clients, the people that we serve? Are we honest in our own biases? That's a really important question. Are we starting to identify where we have biases? Maybe we do want to give advice, but we know that advice giving is not really the way to move forward in helping people find their own empowerment and self-determination. They have to determine what their own solutions are rather than us tell them what the solutions are. Are we making different judgments? And there's so much more. But this is a good example of those bullets there on the right side. On the right side. So social work education in and of itself is going to make you a critically thinking human being. If you've completed all the coursework, you will start to look at the world differently. It's a whole new paradigm for how to think about social problems and what's really going on. What are the underlying issues? What are the hidden oppressions, as well as the overt oppressions, the racism, the racist experiences that many people of color have, the disparities that they experience in society. Because we're a values-based profession, we're always looking at the equality of the individual, family, group, and community, their human rights, their human dignity, and it's really important that we be clear about our values orientation in the process of critical thinking. And it really leaves us with the, if this is true, then what else is true? And then you will begin to make critically informed judgments and social change as a critical thinker if you start thinking about, well, I have this fact, then what else do we know? What else might be true? Because then you start to look at the chain of events, what's really occurring in the entire system. And as you start to build greater intolerance for social justice and human rights abuses, you will shift in emotional responses and start to move towards action for social change. Not just to feel disappointment, distress, anger, and frustration, but start to move into the problem-solving process and looking for opportunities for change. And sometimes those change are incremental small steps with a client, or they may be radical change in the larger scale processes of our social movements, how we engage in advocacy. We start to work at community levels to start to problem solve on large scale. So it depends on where you're entering your focus point on the problem as to where social action occurs. Okay, so in your field practicum, you're going to be asked to write about your experiences and express yourself with critical thinking. You will find yourself being asked to write reflexive responses in your process recordings. And you might want to look for examples. You're going to be given some materials by our social work program, but you can also find examples online. And you want to start looking at the structure for how to write the process recording with examples. Okay, so in final slide here, Gibbons and Gray provide an example of their indicators for critical thinking in the Newcastle program, and they say that, we really have to begin with a clear statement of problem. So what is going on here? If this is true, then we start looking at what's the evidence. By showing that evidence base in the readings that we're doing, making sure that we're clear about what we know about the problem. And then we're able to, as social workers, discuss our own values and belief about a particular issue and assumptions that we're making about that problem. And we're always looking at as many viewpoints as possible to understand the choices that we're making as related to the subjective understanding and judgments that we make. And then we're going to always think about existing theory. And we always need to know what the limitations of knowledge are in the problem area in those theories and practice models. We always know that people of color are frequently excluded from theoretical explanations, and we have to be careful to take that into consideration when we're working with some of the most vulnerable populations that we serve. And then we have applied theory to practice by considering the implications of the problem and the possible solutions in the areas for further research. As I said, this is the Newcastle model for their social work students, and we're always thinking about how do we present the clear and most relevant argument for the solutions that we propose as social workers. Thank you very much.